just moved down to flight speed and we're preparing to...
You have failed me for the last time.
So, recently, Disney's Moana 2, despite being a very divisive movie critically, appears to have been a major animated success for the company, which marks a first, honestly, for them. Starting in 2021, Disney's animated films have been on something of a downturn, with many of them underperforming and just not making back their budget at all. Two pretty notable examples of this were Strange World and Witch, which were both huge financial disasters for the Walt Disney Animation Studios. As a result, it seems like Disney is desperate to regain any sort of following with their animation studios, so they've made Moana 2, a sequel to an already critically acclaimed and commercially successful animated feature, and this one is becoming even more commercially successful. However, perhaps much more interesting than the movie itself, which admittedly is not really that good to begin with, is the fact that this movie is one of the only things that Disney has currently done that still utilizes hand-drawn animation. A lot of people don't realize this, but Disney has actually recently been retraining animators to do hand-drawn animation. And in this particular film, a lot of them were put to the test, with Maui's tattoo actually being hand-drawn animated. It is kind of nice seeing traditional animation still being utilized in even a small way by Disney, since they've abandoned it quite a long time ago, with the last 2D animated feature they ever did now coming out about 15 years ago, that being 2011's Winnie the Pooh. But I suppose this also does beg the question, why did Disney ditch traditional 2D hand-drawn animation? On the surface level, you could perhaps say that the movies weren't performing as well as their computer-animated counterparts, but interestingly enough, there's actually a much deeper answer to what really went on behind the scenes, and Disney themselves actually had a lot to do with it, often self-sabotaging their own films, and also using a certain other franchise from another studio at the time to do exactly this. Believe it or not, this is actually something that happened twice even. There's actually a much more nuanced story than most people realize with how Disney initially ditched 2D animation, so that's what I want to get into in today's video. But in order to set the stage, we need to go back to the early 2000s, during an era where Disney was seemingly beginning to lose its luster. One very critical turning point was in 2001, when Disney's own Atlantis was admittedly a financial flop, and was ultimately outperformed by both Pixar's own Monsters Inc. and DreamWorks' own Shrek. Because of this, around this time, this led the Disney executives to reconsider doing traditional animation at all, and maybe instead pursue computer animation, since it seemed much more lucrative, even though at the end of the day, animation is still animation no matter what, and it's more about getting a story out there that resonates with people than choosing a particular medium that may be trendy at the time. Unfortunately, Disney did not take this into account around this time, and instead chose to very carefully and very not so subtly sabotage their very next traditionally animated film, that being Treasure Planet. Treasure Planet was actually a production from the directing duo of Ron Clements and John Musker, and can actually be traced as far back as the Disney Renaissance. It initially started development between the two directors, who always had the clever idea of putting Treasure Island in space. However, Disney constantly passed on this idea until eventually, after making Hercules, they decided to greenlight the idea between Ron and John, who happily went to work on it since it was their lifelong passion project. Unfortunately for them, this is the exact kind of movie Disney was looking to sabotage also. So, when marketing this film, Disney intentionally chose to make it look very generic despite its inspired visuals and honestly really unique setting and story, and also gave away basically the entire plot of the film in every single trailer. Then, to ensure that Treasure Planet would be doomed to failure and hopefully guarantee them an excuse to move on to 3D animation, they purposely put the release date for Treasure Planet right next to the second Harry Potter film. A lot of you may remember, but specifically around this time, Pottermania had really taken over the world, and the films were some of the highest grossing films of all time. It honestly still are to this day. So intentionally putting a traditionally animated film that had been intentionally marketed very poorly up against the newest Harry Potter film basically guaranteeing the film's death, with no breathing room whatsoever for the movie. Remember this because it will be very important later. In the wake of Disney intentionally bombing Treasure Planet and thus crushing the dreams of two of their best directors ever, all it took were two more traditionally animated flops, that being Brother Bear and Home in the Range, in order for Disney to fully pull the plug on traditional animation. So in the end, Disney basically used a rival studio's franchise, that being Harry Potter, which at the time, again, was huge, as an excuse to end their support of traditional animation. But thankfully, or maybe not, our story does not end here. As stated before, both DreamWorks and Pixar were actually outperforming Disney at the animation box office. Even though Disney actually distributed most of Pixar's films, that seemed to be ending pretty soon, due to an ongoing clash between Michael Eisner, the then CEO of Disney, and Steve Jobs, the then CEO of Pixar. This clash had actually led Pixar to walk out on Disney and look for distribution elsewhere, which, in retrospect, would have been a very bad thing for Disney. And ultimately, Pixar may very well have been better off elsewhere. Oops. But that aside, at the time, this was a very bad thing and a very bad look for the Disney company. Roy E. Disney, who is Walt Disney's nephew, ended up leaving the company and chose to start a campaign to get rid of Michael Eisner from the CEO position. His hope was, with Eisner out of the picture, the Disney company could hopefully recapture some of its former glory, specifically with animation, since the animation division had definitely been suffering a lot under Eisner. Eventually, Eisner relented and resigned from the company in 2005, letting his successor be then ABC president Bob Iger. Bob Iger, looking at the company at the time, immediately knew he had to make a lot of changes to get Disney back on course. And the first of these changes was actually to reinstate Pixar and make a deal with them, since he knew that Pixar could actually be very helpful for getting the animation studio back on track. As a result, he ended up putting then Chief Creative Officer of Pixar, John Lasseter, as the head of Walt Disney Feature Animation for the foreseeable future. And this led John to make many changes himself within the animation division, one of which being going back on the decision that was made a few years earlier to ditch 2D animation altogether and instead reinstated it at the company. He also made a deliberate effort to get back Ron Clements and John Musker, who had left the company after Treasure Planet had been intentionally bombed, and ended up bringing them back for The Princess of the Frog, which was in development at the time as Disney's return to traditional animation. Fortunately for Ron and John, this time their movie actually got good marketing, since now Disney Animation was under new leadership that actually cared about traditional animation and trying to preserve it. As a result, the movie was pushed through several different promotions, including several different ad campaigns, even one with Geico. When the film debuted, it actually did end up being Disney's most successful traditionally animated feature since Lilo and Stitch, and did qualify as a commercial success, although it wasn't quite as successful as Disney had hoped, largely because Avatar had actually come out the exact same week as this film. Ironic, given Disney now owns that too. However, the fact that this film was qualified as a commercial success allowed both Ron and John Lasseter to continue to keep reinstating traditional animation at the animation studio at Disney. However, not everybody was necessarily happy about this decision, most notably the Disney executives who, the very next year, observed just how profitable CG animation could be when done purely at Disney, with Tangled being a massive success for the company. Tangled was actually a movie that was supposed to be traditionally animated at first, but was later switched to CGI during pre-production, which caused a lot of strife about how to animate Rapunzel's long hair in CGI and render each individual strand. This film actually holds the record, funnily enough, for Disney's most expensive animated feature with a budget of a whopping $260 million. Ultimately, however, it did pay off since the film raked in almost $600 million worldwide. Given the fact that John Lasseter, however, was now Chief Creative Officer of the Disney Studios, and at least in his case, he wanted to keep 2D animation where it was now, reinstated at the studio. The executives realized they would have to sabotage another project once again, just like they did with Treasure Planet before, in order to really sweep 2D animation under the rug. At the time, there was actually a new traditionally animated Winnie the Pooh feature being done that had initially been commissioned by John Lasseter, who wanted to make a new Pooh movie for new generations. This, to the executives, seemed like the perfect film to sabotage, so they set to work scrapping different parts of the films that had initially been part of the script. Initially, this Winnie the Pooh movie was going to have 5 different stories adapted from the A.A. Milne books in it, but it was whittled down to 3, and barely over 70 minutes long as a result. And of course, this movie was marketed more as a made-for-TV movie than a real theatrically released film. But the most blatant sign of the sabotage done in this film was the release date, since this Winnie the Pooh movie released the same day as Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, one of the highest-grossing films in cinematic history. This film did not stand a chance at all, especially released on a day like this with a movie event this big right next to it, which makes it all the more clear that Disney very clearly sabotaged this film. If it had been released at any other time in the year, specifically like spring break, it probably would have broken even and done okay, and it likely would have qualified as a commercial success yet again. But clearly, Disney executives did not want that to be the case, so they released it when they did. Yet again, 2D Disney animation was screwed over by Harry Potter. I cannot believe this literally happened twice.
If I
get a nickel for every time
A hand-drawn Disney movie was sabotaged with a Harry Potter movie.
I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
And so, here we are, almost 15 years later, with no sign of a traditional animated Disney film in sight, thanks to this exact kind of meddling behind the scenes. Honestly, it is pretty disappointing. We will likely never get a traditionally animated Disney film ever again because of exactly this. But it is kinda nice to see it implemented in small ways in other movies, like Moana 2, as I said at the start of this video. And at the end of the day, I can always go back and rewatch those Disney classics too that were traditionally animated, which to me really made the Disney brand what it is today. To me at least, those films are truly timeless, and I think they'll be passed down to generations for many, many years to come. Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, give it a like. If you didn't like it, give it a like anyway. If you want to check out all my socials down below, you can see all those down there. And if you want to join my Discord too, where you can communicate with me and others offline, that should be linked down below. And if you want to check out my Letterboxd, that is linked down below as well. That's where I review movies, oftentimes movies or shows I won't review here on YouTube, so you can check that out too if you want extra content from me. But for now, I've been Noah the Otter, and I'll see you on the otter side. Bye!